Welcome to the first Conversations talk that we're giving by OTN webcast. Obviously, we are living in uncertain times, and the reason for this talk is to try and give some help for people who are struggling with these situation that we're all in right now. So I just thought I would begin by saying a little bit about myself. I am a physician, a psychiatrist, and I'm a father of 6 children. Geez, I had to count them for a second there. Usually when I give happiness talks, one of the first things I start with is a question about whether or not people are happier having spinal cord injuries or winning lotteries. And the reality is, the research suggests that after a certain amount of time, there actually isn't any difference between lottery winners and people that sustain spinal cord injuries. And I think if you can imagine what happens after winning a lottery, you realize that people have a lot of expectations of you, they want things from you, and many of them don't think you've earned what you have. And you end up trying to hold on to what you have, and that can have a toxic effect on your relationships. Whereas I think people who sustain spinal cord injuries, it tends to bring families together. This photo of my family here was taken after my uncle had sustained himself spinal cord injuries, a healthy guy that used to cycle, and in a blink of an eye, his life changed. And this is a few months later at the wedding of his son. And it was a beautiful celebration and something he wanted to continue despite the tragedy. So it says a lot about the triumph of the human spirit, and I have seen it myself. The literature also shows that only about 10% of our happiness depends on our circumstances. And so if you look at the work of Sonia Lyubomirsky, or who looked at twins that were raised separately, only 10% of their happiness depended on the circumstances between these twins, identical twins. And Ed Diener has a scholar from Chicago, also similarly showed that really our happiness doesn't really depend too much on what's happening, even though right now we are in the midst of a crisis. In Chinese, the word crisis is Weiji. I don't speak Mandarin, so I can tell you that it's composed of 2 words, which include danger and opportunity. And we are, I think, in many ways in a dangerous situation. We all feel it. But there are opportunities for us to see if we are able to look. Henry Ford once said, when everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. Now, obviously, the planes were not grounded at the time, but there are people in my audience here. There's 3 people. They promised me they would not laugh if the jokes were not funny. So that was the first test run. We are in the middle of a contagion, but there are 2 types of contagion. We have a viral enemy, but also an emotional enemy. An emotional enemy that has led to fear and panic, but I am hoping that people can also discover courage and hope, because these are the 2 enemies we're facing. Invisible enemy on your left, and also another invisible enemy on your right. I think this is especially true for first responders and people who are healthcare workers, because they are the front line of defense and protection. They have fears themselves of getting sick, but also of making mistakes and not serving the people. And they also have the additional fear of trying to take care of their own families. And they have a fear of making their family sick. So there is a lot of stress to go around. I am proposing a 4-step process to contain COVID from an emotional point of view. The first is to use your cortex, your brain, your cerebrum rather than your brainstem or your limbic system, to use awareness and acceptance, and to learn, including leaning into the positives, and to try and make things better. So this talk will be based upon this framework of 4 pillars, these 4 areas. And the first one is to try to be cortical or cognitive. In the middle of it, we have to admit that for many, they're exhausted, overwhelmed, and anxious, especially the people who are on the front lines that are taking care of people that are very sick. Many of us are fearful and fatigued, frustrated and dismayed. Again, for those that are working really hard, a workload that's not sustainable. For those of us that are alone and at home, isolated, not able to touch and feel, hug the people we love. And we have fear and confusion because everything keeps changing. The foundation of our lives, the very way that we used to live, changed over the course of a few weeks. I mean, who would have really believed that this could happen? So the first step when you are facing anxiety is to try to be rational. And being rational means using your thinking part of your brain rather than the reactive part of your brain. In other words, it's using your cortex versus your limbic system. Because your cortex is responsible for the ability to think, sustain attention, to have empathy, insight, whereas the limbic system is more associated with fight or flight. So it's a very reactive thing, it's a primitive thing, but humans have the ability to step back and to overcome their immediate reactions and respond. So how do we respond? Well, one of the best ways to respond is actually to begin with the facts. And if we look at our first enemy, the invisible enemy, which is the virus, we have to know something about it. And one of the things that we know about it is that it has specific qualities, one of which is its the structure itself has these spike glycoproteins which form the corona, which is why it is called the coronavirus. And it in fact is not the first coronavirus the world has faced. The first coronavirus was in 2003. This is coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2 is the name for the actual virus. COVID is the name that the World Health Organization gave to the disease. Now, how does SARS-CoV-2 gain access to our bodies? It's through the ACE2 receptor, which stands for the angiotensin converting enzyme 2. It's on the alveolar cells, so it's on the cells of your lung, and it's the open door. Now we know something about ACE2 because it's, for those of us that are on blood pressure medications, part of how the blood pressure medications work are through angiotensin converting enzyme 1. So this is part of our normal body and the way we regulate our own blood pressure, but the virus uses that as the way to get in. Technical difficulty here. So these are courtesy of the CDC. This is an image of the virus in our bodies. It binds to the alveolar cells through this ACE receptor. This is that yellow thing that's protruding from the cell wall. And it gets incorporated into the cell. And it results afterwards in the cells becoming scarred or fibrotic, and that's what leads to the problems and the symptoms itself, which can include fatigue, fever, and dry cough. If you look at the various studies, fever seems to be one of the most prominent features, and the severity of the illness, if it becomes more severe, if it does, the fever becomes more pronounced, as does the problems breathing and the cough. And there is a typical disease course. The median incubation is about 4 days. Usually you get shortness of breath after 6 days, and 10 days after exposure, usually you may end up in the ICU. But the important thing to remember is that that actually is quite rare. The other piece to look at in this disease course is the rationale for 14-day isolation for people who are traveling. It's to recognize that this all happens quite quickly. And if you are exposed, it should demonstrate itself fairly quickly. And there are different phases of the disease which lead to the symptoms that we experience. And it is important to realize that only a small percentage of patients go on to have severe complications. This is different than some of the other epidemics we have had in the past. But it is also important to realize that it does affect people preferentially, and in particular the elderly, and men more than women. So this is a graph that just shows the presence across different countries, the incidence of how severe it can be as you get older. And it does tend to affect the vulnerable with other conditions. This is data from the World Health Organization and from from the Chinese data. I found this slide also to be quite helpful. This is from the journal Nature, and it just looks at the different kinds of viruses we've faced, and the case fatality rate in this slide just demonstrates that COVID is actually a fairly low fatal illness compared to Ebola or Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, or even the first SARS, which had a case fatality rate of about 10%. Its reproduction number is also between 2 and 3. Now that is a logarithmic scale, but it just puts things into perspective. It is similar to the 1918 Spanish flu. However, the Spanish flu also affected young people and didn't discriminate in the way this virus does. I think the other fact that is particularly alarming to people are the curves that you see. And as you can tell, the curves do go up. The thing that we are starting to see now are the curves beginning to bend. So there is some hope, including in Ottawa, but in other places as well, and other countries that have actually come through this, and I'll talk about that after. So keep in mind that the fatality rate's actually low, relatively speaking, compared to some of these other infections, and the majority of infections are in fact mild. A study from last week demonstrated that in fact 50% of the people don't even realize that they have it. So in Iceland, they tested nearly 5% of their population. Half of them were asymptomatic, and of that people that they tested that were asymptomatic, they did not know that they actually had it. But they could test, and they could tell based on the mutations where, in fact, the virus came from, which country it came from. So those are the facts. But the other fact is we are facing an enemy that doesn't think. We are stronger, smarter, and we work together. And I don't think anyone doubts that we will win. Everyone's just asking, how long is this going to take? Because we absolutely will win this fight. And part of that is based on the fact that we have human ingenuity. There are things we can do, each of us, to stop this. We can starve the virus, and that is what we're doing now by isolating, by limiting our contacts, physical contacts with people. So as you can see, just doing that is a way of fighting this and starving the virus. The other thing is using personal protective equipment, especially for those that are first responders or those that are in healthcare. We need to use this properly. We can also kill the virus by cleaning. And realize that the virus, the primary mode of transmission is phone-like to face. So don't touch your face. My second youngest daughter asked me a couple of days ago, she said, does the virus have legs? And I think that's actually a funny question. It's a good question. The reality is, no, it doesn't, but it actually sort of does. Why? Because our hands are its legs. So we have to stop touching our face. That's one benefit of wearing a mask, is hopefully you stop touching your face. There are different strategies you can use to touch your face less. I remember when this first came out, someone was talking about the importance of not touching their face, and in the video they used their finger to turn the page. They licked their finger and then turned the page. So.
Yeah.
The other thing is to remember that we have ways of killing this thing, and part of it is just using soap. We can crack the envelope because it has a lipid bilayer of the virus, that corona, that the glycoproteins are around the lipid bilayer, and we can crack the envelope just by creating micelles, and soap is the way to do it. Wash your hands for 20 seconds, mostly because you really want to get into every crevice. Use lots of soap. You can use alcohol-based soaps, alcohol-based sanitizers if soap is not available. But we can crack the envelope. It's actually not that hard. The whole world, literally millions of people, are working on strategies to break this virus. And there are guided missiles that are in process, and people are studying them with great vigor. The other thing we realize, because I was saying, we all know that we're going to win this fight, and the reality is what we need is a vaccine. We need herd immunity, and that it will come. They have already begun phase 2 trials in the States, so we have started repurposing adenovirus. We are creating vaccines, and they just need to be tested for enough time to make sure they're safe for widespread use. For those of you that have not looked at the science behind coronavirus, there's an excellent YouTube video by Patrick Sun Xiong. It's actually part of a series, but you can watch it on YouTube. And he talks about the science behind it, including trying to block its entry through the ACE2 receptor, looking at its packaging, so the machinery of the virus, in particular the way that it repurposes the cell, the Golgi apparatus, and also the endosomal packaging. So there are different strategies that scientists and healthcare people, physicians, are studying to win this fight. And it is a fight we can win. You can also look at destroying the actual cells that are infected, which is part of the work that people are looking at with the immune system. So there are different strategies. Current treatments right now include antimalarials. There are some promising studies from Marseille University, and in combination with azithromycin. There are various antivirals that people are studying. There are some data from China that suggest that some of these antivirals work. And there are also monoclonal antibodies targeting specific things, including the virus itself, but also our immune reaction and the cytokine storm that happens after the infection. This is old technology, convalescent plasma from recovered patients. This started in 1910. But we are using it. The problem is that you can usually treat 2 or 3 people from the convalescent plasma. But we can scale it up once we identify the globulins. So the thing is to scale up some of these treatments. So it is only a matter of time before we find effective treatments. And there was a study published in the Journal of Science that just this last week that suggested a possible Achilles heel to the coronavirus. And it involves something that binds to one of the spike glycoproteins. So this came from a patient that suffered from SARS-CoV-1, the first SARS virus. They took it from a patient, they had these antibodies created. There's also research looking at how we can use other drugs that are currently in use for patients to see how they can modify the disease progression, including angiotensin receptor blockers. So there is emerging research, and I would say lots of hope because of it. We do have a good chance to defeat this quickly because there are so many people working on it. The next step, after you have the facts, is to try and see how you deal with it, because there's nothing as scary as not knowing what you're facing. And that was the first enemy, was the invisible enemy, which is the virus. The other part that we struggle with is our reaction to the virus, our fears of the virus. And awareness and acceptance is part of how we first overcome this fear. As Eckhart Tolle once said, awareness is the greatest agent for change. I think we have to realize that death, disease, and accidents happen. They are part of our lives, but we also have to accept that these are not normal times. We really are living in unprecedented times. But the strategies we use to deal with stress can also be applied to us now, more widespread. And one of those strategies involves recognizing your emotions. It's important to actually characterize it. When you think of the emotions you have, some people say things like, I feel stressed. Now, they may also say, I am stressed. And you can see that the difference between feeling stressed and being stressed gives a person more control if they are aware that it's just the emotion of feeling this way, and rather than that's who you are. So recognizing your emotions is the first step. You can also change how you feel based on what you think. None of us can control how we feel. We can't force ourselves to be happy. We can't force ourselves to be sad. But how do we do those? How do we make those changes? We change it because we change what we think. And we can change what we think by our effort. We have to, the first part, as I was saying, was to have the facts, but also to be aware that the emotions you have, whether or not it is feeling overwhelmed, it is a feeling. And there are things you can do, for example, if you are overwhelmed. One thing you can do is look at the parts of your life that make you feel overwhelmed and compartmentalize it, gain control over it, because you can strategically address the feeling of being overwhelmed. But you have to be aware of it first before you can deal with it. So you have to develop these pockets of control. We also have to face our fears. You know, I think one of the biggest challenges is facing our worst fears. Many of us think that our worst fears are going to happen, which is obviously not true. But I think when you face your worst fears, all the other ones sort of fall away. Now, we are, for many of us, we are physically separated, but we don't have to be emotionally separated. Our fears of suffering, I think it helps, as I will talk later, about putting things into context. And mortality is a fear we all have. It's part of living, and we need to be able to face that as well. But also with the facts of realizing that most people, most people, if they even get infected, won't even have the symptoms. So Stephen Covey, synthesizing Viktor Frankl, said, between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response, our growth and freedom. I think that's a profound quote. And Viktor Frankl, which I will talk about in 2 slides from now, has a lot to teach us because he, as a psychiatrist, went through Auschwitz. Our circumstances don't define us, but our choices do. We need to be able to respond and not react, and to be conscious of those choices. And I'll try to illustrate that in the next. I actually went to a talk about 15, 20 years ago about this fellow who was kidnapped. And he was an architect in Mexico and talked about how he found freedom while he was imprisoned in a 6x9 cell. And how did he do that? He realized that his family were trying to secure his release, and he realized that despairing, which he ended up doing at one point, and giving up, was not something that was helping him. It wasn't helping his family. He realized he had some control. And in fact, he told me later that he became incredibly fit during this imprisonment. He did a lot of push-ups and sit-ups. Obviously, none of us are in a 6x9 cell, I hope. But he became a lot stronger and fitter, he said, than he ever did become later in his life. And when I talked to him after this, it was a talk at the University of Ottawa. And he talked about how he gained control of his life in that moment, because he realized what he could control and what he couldn't, and that he was able to do these things for his family. Later on, when I was meeting him at one of the university residences afterwards, he was talking about his own life and how they were sending proof of life videos during this ordeal to try and get money for his release. And many years later, he was having some difficulties in his marriage, and they were fighting, and his wife showed him one of the videos when he was in prison, and he realized he was happier in that moment than he was later on after he had been freed. So I think that's a profound message, that even though we're in terrible circumstances, it doesn't mean that has to determine how we feel. And Viktor Frankl once said that everything can be taken from man but one thing, the last of human freedoms: to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. I think that's an incredibly powerful message, that even if you can control nothing else, the one thing you can control is how you face it, your attitude, whether or not you accept it, or whether or not you don't accept it. That's your choice. And this is from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. In Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he likes to quote Nietzsche, who says, "A why can bear almost any how." He lived through Auschwitz. He was an Austrian psychiatrist. He lost his wife. Terrible things that happened during that time. And he describes in this book how he was trying to understand why people survived, why the strongest person didn't survive, nor the smartest. He found that the people that survived were the ones that had a reason to live. Whether or not that reason was to be with their family, or to suffer for their family, or for God, or even to get back at the Nazis. If they had a reason, that was how they got through it. I remember telling this story to one of my patients, and it was very humbling, because my patient told me he knew Viktor Frankl because he was in the concentration camp with him. And I think logotherapy is something many of us, as the fourth wave of psychotherapies, we try to use with our patients. But our patients can teach us a lot. And he told me a little bit about what his experience was with knowing him and what he learned. It turns out that meaning is actually a matter of life and death. So this is a study from JAMA last year, and they found that people who had a purpose or a meaning in life actually lived longer. So this is a life purpose score, and you can see those with a very low life purpose have much lower survival probability. And this data is not on its own. There is actually a good body of literature that shows that when you have purpose, you're less likely to be hospitalized and less likely also to die. This is a study that was done about 10 years before the paper that I showed you in JAMA. Having a purpose actually helps us get through this. So there is literature to support this. The study from 2009 showed that there's about a 2 times hazard ratio of dying if you don't have a purpose. So it's not so much the stress, but the meaning to which we ascribe the stress that matters. Once you have a meaning or purpose, it puts things in perspective and helps us overcome. And what is the meaning for all of us that are perhaps in our own rooms, or our apartments? What's the meaning of the sacrifices we're all making? One thing that is, I think, very profound is that this is a test of the survival of the non-fittest. We're all trying to protect the elderly, the vulnerable. This is a chance for humanity to rise up and to protect the people who need to be protected. The vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the disabled. This is what we're doing this for them. Many of the younger people will not have any symptoms. So this is in large part for them. Now, Tony Robbins said that people don't value what they don't fight for. And this is something we need to fight for. The other beautiful thing is to realize life's beauty and its fragility. So Susan Davis, a psychologist trained at Harvard, once said that life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. And we can see that. We know that part of the beauty and preciousness of life is its fragility. You know, we experience things that are incredibly beautiful and important to us, and we realize that part of that is knowing how much it could affect us to lose it. And that's part of its beauty. When you look at, you know, I remember watching each of my children sleep at night. It was a sublime experience, but you also knew in a way that it wouldn't last. There is something of a connection between, at least in this world, of love and suffering. And when you love something, you know there is a chance to suffer a lot if you lose it. And that's part of the fears I think we have. We don't just fear for ourselves, but we fear for the people we love. And it is because we have that fear, it means we have something to lose. We have something meaningful. And there is this connection. Because discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. If you don't care about anything, you won't suffer as much. The third part of my suggested strategy is to learn. So there is a saying from John Maxwell, sometimes you win and sometimes you learn. I think that's kind of profound, that it's actually in the times that you don't get what you want that you actually grow. And what is it that we need to learn? How about appreciating that we need to be inspired and that we can inspire people? I see people every day that inspire me. And part of that inspiration is in being able to face your fears. And that's through adversity that we grow. And seeing the hidden advantages or opportunities that were created by that very same adversity. If you look at 9/11, this iconic image of afterwards, because obviously many firefighters, first responders died in this trying to save people, but these are heroes. I have, as I was saying, I have 6 kids, and one of their favorite movies is Megamind, and in it he says, heroes are made, not born. Because out of the ashes of adversity and tragedy come kindness, bravery, sacrifice. And in these times, we are, especially in places where the healthcare systems are being overwhelmed, these heroes are being created every day. This is Dr. Li Wenliang from China. He was an ophthalmologist, at first censured, but later recognized as a hero and a martyr. This is a picture from Hong Kong. For those of you that don't know this, about 40% of the victims of the first SARS infection were from Hong Kong. So these guys realize that this guy's a hero. And I think we need to as well. There are lots of heroes that are fighting this battle. This is an image of some of the people on the front lines in Italy. This is at a time where Italy has begun to bend its own curve. But they went through a terrible time. Lots of bravery and sacrifice. If you look at them, their eyes are tired, their cheekbones are rubbed raw from protective masks, they don't smile. Look at Lucia Perolari, 24, a nurse from this hospital in Bergamo. They these heroes of this epidemic aren't just treating the sick with respirators and oxygen, they're standing in for sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, who under normal circumstances would be able to visit, hold the hands of the sick, loved ones, and offer a word of encouragement. But these heroes are also in North America. This is a first responder, a healthcare worker. They can't see their families because they work in COVID units. So this person can't touch their children, but they come to see them through glass. Or this grandfather that walks 4 miles a day to see his newborn grandson. These are heroes and stories to inspire us. There's also silver linings. Like I was saying, we need to be able to, through this adversity, see that there are things that we can learn and things that can make our lives better. So these are pictures from Venice. Usually the water's black. It's turquoise now, and they have dolphins in it. There's fresh air. So there's a lot that we can learn. So if you decide to go for a walk outside, you may find that it's cleaner. There are other silver linings that we can see in this time. So Blaise Pascal said, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. There are lots of spiritual opportunities for us. This came from a parishioner at my own church. He said, the world is falling silent, which is perhaps exactly what we needed. As much as the circumstance is dire, it is also a privilege to bake homemade bread, homeschool my daughter, and watch our children play together instead of coming home exhausted from work and daycare every day. I was missing this before, and I'm so thankful for these peaceful moments in the storm. Also prayerful that this ends soon and no more lives are lost. These times remind us of our dependency on God and the power of prayer. I think it's fair to say that many of us live incredibly busy lives. Some of us spend hours every day driving between activities. But now that everything is paused, maybe this is a chance for us to look at our priorities and the effect that we had on doing so much. What kind of effect on the inside did it have? You know, I was going across some of the literature on stress for this talk, and it's funny, before this external stress we experienced, the World Health Organization had been saying that stress was the health epidemic of the 21st century. This is before an external stress. And it's manifested in the way when we see our doctors, the symptoms we have, the physical symptoms we have. It is manifested in many ways. And we were in an epidemic without a real explanation for it. We were having lots more stuff. You know, this is the adjusted mean income in the United States, and it's true of the world. We went from a 30% extreme global poverty rate over 30, 40 years to a 10% poverty rate. But everything in the world had been, from using just external measures, getting better. But our anxiety and depression just kept getting worse. This is data from the college students from 2008 to 2017, both with anxiety and depression. And we are now able to step back and think, well, what was the cause of that? We didn't have an external stress, but now we have this massive global external stress. I think we may have a lot to learn for how we face these emotional challenges. Maybe it was because we had too much and too much free time, well, not free time, but too much time spent doing stuff and not actually living, that we struggled so much. So what will the effect of us taking this forced pause on the extras in our life? Well, maybe we can improve ourselves. This is a Lego picture that these guys are saying, no thanks, we're too busy to improve ourselves. And maybe that's what we were like before. We were just too busy to try and make things better. This COVID reset may be a chance for us, you know, to improve our own lives, but it may be a way to improve our healthcare system too. We are learning a whole bunch of things that would never have been possible had we not faced this challenge. So the fourth step in resiliency building is moving forward, making progress, making things better. I was saying to the people here, a small group of people in this audience here, that I watched about 40 or 50 videos on resilience, and I also did some research on resilience to prepare for this talk. I put some resilience. But these stories are these harrowing tragedies that common themes that I found. One of them, of this person, Lindsay, who had went through this boating accident and lost her leg, and she almost died. And one of the things she said is, what helped her a lot was realizing in the moment what could be worse now. That's a kind of reverse way of being grateful. She was grateful her children didn't see the accident, that her children weren't swimming too at the time. You'll hear, if you go through some of these talks of terrible tragedies, and my own patients that I have experienced, they are able to realize that things could have been much worse. Now, we all, with anxiety, fear that things are going to get worse later, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in the moment, realizing that things could be worse, because that helps give you some gratitude or appreciation for your own experience. As you sit there, wherever you are listening to this, you can actually think, well, what are 5 ways my life could be worse right now? And I will tell you that that will actually make you feel better. As long as you don't believe that those 5 things are going to happen like next day. That's an important thing. The other thing is to look for the hidden advantage of your situation. Even though these things are happening, what actually can be gained by what's happening, and to put things into perspective. And comparing progress not to other people but to yourself. That's actually one of Jordan Peterson's 12 rules for life, is don't compare yourself to other people, compare yourself to yourself, and try to make yourself better. This is Lucy Holmes, a psychologist. She was actually doing graduate studies when she lost her daughter from a motor vehicle accident. And she was saying that she actually had been, in her research or graduate studies, looking at resiliency. And she had to apply some of the research to her own life, and she realized that the research was actually greatly lacking. Our framework, Kubler-Ross's framework for stages of grief, were sadly lacking for people going through it. Mostly because it didn't give her a sense of hope. And this is what she said. She said, what I needed most was hope. I needed a journey through all the anguish, pain, and longing. Most of all, I wanted to be an active participant in the grief process. And she talks again about those 3 secrets that are actually very similar to many of the other stories you'll hear about people going through tragedies and overcoming them. The first is acceptance or awareness. The other is looking at the benefits of your circumstance, the benefits that are potentially there, but also, very importantly, not to forget what you have because of what you've lost, and seeing whether or not whatever you're doing is helping or hurting. And that's, I think, a profound message when we have lost something. We may focus a lot on what we've lost, but forget what we have. And it's important to have gratitude and to be thankful. Because if you aren't thankful, you don't hold on to what you have, you lose that too. So she was talking about the importance of helping and improving, and every decision she made, everything she did, she tried to look at it in the framework of, is what I'm doing helping me or hurting me? And that's what I was saying about the M of calm is make it better, make progress. Actually, all of the therapies we use are based on this premise. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is based on the premise that we have an incorrect way of thinking. And if we correct the way we think, it will change what we do and also how we feel. Like I was saying, we don't control what we feel, but we do control what we think and we control what we do. But the underlying idea is to improve what you are thinking and improving what you're doing so that you will feel better. And behavioral activation and exercise is a big part of it. Same with interpersonal psychotherapy. The underlying premise of interpersonal psychotherapy, it doesn't try to look at what the cause of the depression is, whether or not it's a the underlying part to it is that our relationships affect how we feel. If we improve our relationships, we'll improve how we feel. And that's an important thing for us as a message to have in this time. Just because you are physically apart from someone does not mean you can't improve your relationships. It's actually quite shocking. One of the longest studies for human development and survival is the Grant and Glueck study, the famous Harvard longitudinal study. They found that meaningful relationships at the age of 50 predicted survival better than anything else. Better than blood pressure, better than any of the other measures we use to try and keep people well at the age of 50. So can you imagine a revolution in medicine where the main thing we try and do is get people to improve their relationships? Call the people who you know or would love to hear from you. Send them well, I don't know if you can send letters. You can send letters. They can just watch the letters. Send them emails, texts, tweets. Dialectical behavioral therapy is very similar. Again, it's a type of modified cognitive behavioral therapy. The idea is a combination of acceptance and change. But the change, along with the radical acceptance, is the insistence that you try and make things better. Same with motivational therapy. The underlying premise is when you want to make a behavioral change, you want the person to see where they are and where they want to be. And you want to help them find that way of getting to where they want to be, which is an improvement. And again, in problem-solving therapy, it's the same thing. There actually is a good body of literature to support its use in geriatrics. Geriatrics is my subspecialty in psychiatry, using problem-solving skills so to make things better, and using these challenges as a way of growing and seeing them not so much as obstacles, but as challenges to overcome. So we need to get stronger. Resilience is the capacity to adapt to negative change and recover from it as quickly as possible. You develop resistance, however, by going through tough times. That's how you develop the resilience. It is said, a comfort zone is a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there. This is, I think, a nice picture. I hope you can forgive the potential red stuff there. Life does not get easier, you just get stronger. So your old me may have been defeated by one arrow, but as you get older, you become stronger, and the things that would have defeated you before won't defeat you later as you develop resilience. Now the word courage comes from the Latin word cor, or heart, and we have to not lose heart. One of the most touching scenes from It's a Wonderful Life with George Bailey, these three angels, Franklin, Joseph, and Clarence, are talking, and they said, boy, you have to go see George, he's in big trouble. And Clarence asks, why, is he sick? And they said, no, worse, he's discouraged. He was at the point in his life, even though he went through terrible things, he went through a war, terrible things, but he didn't realize what he had come through and what he had to lose, and how the perspective of his life. And we can lose that type of perspective when we're in a state of despair. We have to overcome this type of despair. We need to choose hope and be constructive. We need to choose life. We need to try and make our lives better. So how do we lift ourselves and each other up? Exercise, downtime, a bit of, even though if you're at home and you need something to help stop yourself from reading all the news feeds and all of the stuff that seems overwhelming. Try to play a bit and have some humor. Our own family across the country, they had these quarantine games. We all sent in these videos of contests for how to develop hazmat suits, how to stay sane, how to develop works of art with tissue paper. And it was a fun thing. And it connected us. And I think it's a beautiful thing that we can do. And in a way, we don't see our family or connect with them as much. And we can because of technology and because of our awareness of it. It turns out that laughter is the best medicine. There's a prospective study with an elderly in a day hospital, and you can lower your blood pressure just by laughing, having stand-up comedians come in and make you laugh. But Jose says you can't make someone laugh. You have to be funny. So we have to find a way to laugh. Jokes connect us, they embrace us. When you make someone laugh, you're not just being funny, you are inducers of hope, embracers of strangers, eradicators of hopelessness. You are physicians and peacemakers. So this is one of my favorite cartoons. It's Calvin and Hobbes. He says, sometimes I think the surest sign that intelligent life exists elsewhere, that intelligent life exists elsewhere is that in the universe is that no one has tried to contact us. And why do I think that? Well, it has to do with tissue paper. And this is a quote. I used to spin that toilet paper like it was the wheel of fortune. Now I turn it like I'm cracking a safe. Winston Churchill said, you cannot hope to understand the most serious things in life unless you understand the most humorous. Because if you lose the power to laugh, you lose the power to think. Humor obliges us to have an open mind. It obliges empathy and forgiveness. Humor always forgives. Now, I just wanted to make a comment again about the physical versus psychological separation. We are talking about social distancing everywhere, but that's not necessarily a great message because it's not a social thing to separate yourself. I think it's physical distancing that we need to do because we can still be connected with people and the people we love. Either it can be with a telephone or it can be with FaceTime or Zoom or something that we use to connect in a way maybe we didn't think of using before. Because physical distance isn't the biggest problem. The loneliest place in the world is a crowded room. But the reason why this person feels so alone is because they don't have meaningful relationships. So you can, even though you're somewhere alone or somewhere separated from your family, physically, you can reach out and strengthen these meaningful relationships in your life. Strengthen them. Eric Fromm once said, all men are in need of help and depend on one another. Human solidarity is the necessary condition for the unfolding of any one individual. We are literally all in this together, even though you've probably heard that too many times in the last few weeks. It's true. The other thing is to realize that compassion means sharing the suffering of other people. Passion means suffering in Latin, and compassion means shared suffering. The Swedish proverb I like is, shared joy is double joy, shared sorrow is half sorrow. When we share something with a friend, it is especially, if it's good, it's especially good, and if it's sad, it's less sad. Now, obviously with physical distancing, this is okay with your family, but you get the message. So how can we dance together again? Well, there is hope at the end of this. If you look at countries that have come through this, this is from a publication called The Hammer and the Dance. There are strategies that work. South Korea is not, they're not in lockdown. They're living their lives normally, as is China. The key is testing, targeted quarantine, contact tracing. It lets you know how you're doing. So when we open things up, as long as we have testing available, we can start to begin to live our normal lives. Ultimately, at least until a vaccine is available, once the vaccine happens, this is over. Our lives resume. So these are strategies that will help us come out of this, Wuhan and South Korea. And we have to also realize each day we are closer to the end of this pandemic. It will be in the back mirror. We'll be looking back at this and think about all these times that we had where we couldn't go shopping or couldn't get our hair cut. It was one of the funny things from the quarantine game. Someone was showing how they were cutting their hair themselves. So how do we change this stress into resilience? It is by effort. We will be better, stronger, and faster after this. This is something from the 70s, from my childhood, the $6 Million Man. Obviously, there's inflation. It's probably the $6 trillion man now. In sharing in this hardship together, we can learn to be kinder, braver, and more resilient, but maybe 6 feet apart. Thank you. I guess there can't be any questions, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today in this first of a series of conversations at the Royal. And this video, it will be webcast. It's already recorded and archived, and the Royal will make it available for people if they're interested in looking. So thank you.